impression. You're like, live. We're
Live.
live. That was my Logan impression. It was awful. I know.
Spot on. Absolutely. Well, we got a few people in the chat. Fa of the QTube family, Hunky Vape. Thanks, guys, for chiming in and getting to the top of the leaderboard. And for all of you watching at home, watching on the replay, thank you for tuning in. We will have a conversation here with Professor Gerry Stimson coming up. But first, hey, Kristen, how you doing?
Hi. I'm hanging in there. We made it. But I have to make sure. I'm looking for the rundown bumper because I don't want to forget it.
Excellent. Peggy at E6 Source, thanks for chiming in. I'm doing okay. Just had a long week. Just got back from e-cigarette summit in DC.
Yeah.
There was a Taxpayers Protection Alliance panel the day after. A lot of good conversations, a lot of good presentations, a lot of thoughtful stuff, and some really good feedback also about this program here. Had a couple people walk up to me and say that folks I didn't expect, walking up and saying that they were watching this and they really appreciated it and they thought we were doing a good job. So really glad that this can be a useful resource for people, not just our consumer members, but folks in the research and policy space. So thanks everybody for showing up. And I will put that mild pitch in there for folks. If you do find this resource useful, please visit our site and also visit our donate button. That's your contributions help us do this every other week in perpetuity or as long as we are necessary. So want to try to be efficient with our time here. And I think I will get right into the legislative rundown.
I'll do the thing.
Fantastic. Oh, we didn't even let it finish.
I didn't.
In the spirit of abbreviated things here, I will. This is going to be really quick. We have two states kind of flaring up as we go through the weekend. Louisiana, which is looking at a flavor ban. This has been amended. And I think it's a PMTA registry bill, which is, for those who are unfamiliar, sort of states signing up to do the FDA's work for them. They become the enforcement arm of federal regulations. And this is actually an amendment that is being pushed by a company and an active website.
You're breaking up. It's being pushed by a what?
It is being pushed by a tobacco company.
Oh, okay.
And this was recently called out in Maine, which is the other engagement that we have up. Maine LD 1215 moved over to the Senate, I believe. And so we're waiting to see what the next hearing will be on that bill. But it was called out as an amendment straight from R.J. Reynolds. And it's, again, a PMTA registry bill that would make Maine the enforcer of FDA rules. So those are our calls to action that are on fire this weekend. If you live in Louisiana or Maine, please get involved. I know Maine, we could really use some more engagement, sparsely populated state, but still, if you got friends and family in Maine, let them know, send them to CASAA.org and tell them to get involved. With that, I think we can rifle right into the main content of the day.
All right, let's bring them in.
I told you it'd be quick.
Hi.
So welcome. Thank you, Professor Gerry Stimson, for joining us on a Saturday evening, your time.
Well, it's great to be on the show. Thank you for asking me. I've got a very fond feeling for CASAA because I think you were probably the first consumer advocacy group globally, and probably the biggest and the most active. So it's a real pleasure to be talking to you both tonight.
Fantastic. Well, it's a privilege to have you on, and I think we'll get right into it. Want to be respectful of your time. For folks who are not familiar with you or your work, it's always best to kind of leave the introduction up to you guys. But in particular, my other than your background is, coming from harm reduction, a lot of experience in harm reduction on other issues. Yeah. And one of the things that you talk about in your article is sort of that a bit of a shock or disappointment at people who you worked with on those issues being somewhat resistant or just outright rejecting harm reduction for tobacco. So maybe, giving us a bit of your background, and also I think talking about your experiences with people's reaction to THR.
Yeah, well, the Filter article was really a kind of a look back at 10 years of tobacco harm reduction, and some of the highs and some of the lows and some of the disappointments, but also trying to be optimistic about the future. It's a bit difficult to summarize my work prior to THR, but although a lot of it makes sense. I mean, I've got 5 decades of work, which is a bit embarrassing to mention, and I was in the kind of harm reduction field in different ways. I'm an academic social scientist. Most of my work has been in the public health arena and mostly on drug use, serious addiction problems, and so on and so forth. So before coming to the THR space, I'd got a lot of experience in drugs harm reduction, although it wasn't called that until 1987. That word harm reduction was first invented with respect to drugs by a mate of mine called Russell Newcomb in 1987. But going right back, the first job I had as a researcher was doing work with people who were getting prescriptions for pharmaceutical heroin addicts in London. And we had a clinic system where some people were getting pharmaceutical heroin. There's a long history of that in the UK. Others were getting methadone and so on. So I with a colleague of mine, we interviewed about a third of the people at clinics in London who were getting pure pharmaceutical heroin on prescription to inject. Now, some of them, not all of them, some of them managed very well on that. They led pretty ordinary, even rather dull lives, because they're kind of quite managed lives. So that, that's harm reduction, and that goes back actually a long way in the UK with the prescribing of heroin. Jump forward to the mid 80s, the UK realized, as other countries did, that there was a new disease going around, HIV/AIDS, and there were many vulnerable populations, including people who inject drugs. So I was still doing research. I was doing academic teaching as well, but I was called in by the UK government, was one of the first to decide to give free needles and syringes to people who are injecting. Very smart move. Actually, first suggested in Scotland in 1986, because they had 3 cities where there were a lot of people with HIV infection who were injecting, and very, very straightforward, very simple report said, amongst other things, you must give, make available clean needles and syringes to people who are injecting if they insist on continue to inject. So that became, it kind of slipped in pretty easily into the UK policy scenario. And I was called in by the UK government to evaluate, they set up a pilot program of needle exchange. So I was called in to evaluate that program across the UK and in England, Scotland, and in Wales. And that was rolled out incredibly quickly, and the research was very interesting. Who would have known that people who injected drugs were actually quite interested in their health? Because that's the big thing, the image was, these people just don't want to care for themselves. But it was a very interesting engagement. There were a lot of agencies who started distributing needles and syringes. There was kind of almost like a collaborative engagement, because for many people who injected drugs, nobody had really spoken to them much in a nice way before. They'd been treated pretty coercively, even in drug treatment clinics, but suddenly there was this new relationship developing, and you can see threads here about my interest in consumers and users and getting engaged with people. So the UK response to HIV/AIDS was pretty good, along with there were good bits in the US who were doing it, in California. There were people in Australia who were doing it, in much of Europe. So I eventually became, as it were, a card-carrying harm reductionist. And a lot of my colleagues in public health supported drugs harm reduction, supported drug law reform, and so on. I eventually retired from academic research around 2004. I decided I desperately needed a career change, and started to run a small, I took over an existing advocacy organization called the International Harm Reduction Association, a drugs advocacy organization. Mainly had two threads. One was to keep harm reduction, or to try to get harm reduction integrated into the UN system, the WHO, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNICEF, and so on. But it also had a human rights thread. We might come back to that later. So I did that for about 6 years, and then that stopped. And around 2010, which brings us a little bit more up to date, I'd heard about e-cigarettes, and I started to get interested in tobacco harm reduction. I thought, well, this just looks like what I've been doing. This looks very much, there hadn't been a good vehicle for tobacco harm reduction. I mean, there were NRT products and pretty boring things, and you were made, you're a patient, really made to look like you're treating yourself. But e-cigarettes seemed to be, a great solution, and I thought, well, there's something really interesting happening here. And at last, tobacco, the field of tobacco smoking, had something, a safer delivery system, which is what it's about. People want to use nicotine for whatever reason. But so I'm very excited about this, as you can tell from my filter article. And I thought that many of my colleagues in public health in the UK would be likewise excited about it, because a lot of them had got excited about drugs harm reduction. But no, this, when it came to smoking and tobacco, they had a kind of a different hat on, which was, don't trust the tobacco industry. All these products are going, the kind of the story. And so that was a lot. There've been a lot of struggles, but we can talk about those in a moment. So it was not the easy move that here I thought, it doesn't even cost any money to do this, because for years I'd been, involved in big international projects where you have millions of dollars to run programs, but tobacco harm reduction costs nothing. It doesn't cost governments or state nothing. So what a perfect bit of public health intervention. Small p, small h, not big P, h. Small public health done by people. But it hasn't quite turned out like that. And, you've got your problems, there are problems in other countries, but we can expand on that. But that's a very, very quick summary. And I mean, I've been involved in lots of different things in the last 10 years trying to promote tobacco harm reduction. But that's kind of 5 decades, and here we are today.
Yeah. So rapidly bringing us to the present, and I think we can't avoid having this conversation with you without talking about GFN, and so what for people who don't know, what is GFN, and I think we've probably already answered the question, is why is it so consumer focused, but for folks who haven't experienced it, what are your hopes and dreams and efforts with GFN?
Well, the Global Forum on Nicotine, it's our 10th anniversary. First round's 2014. I'd done a little bit of THR work up to then. I'd been on, there was a government health committee on tobacco harm reduction, which I'd been on, and I'd done a little bit of trying to get some research going on getting safer nicotine product into prisons. But with Paddy Costal, who's my kind of buddy in a lot of this, we thought, well, actually what we need is a conference about all these things that are happening. And we realized had to be a conference on nicotine, not on, there were conferences on smoking cessation, what can you do to persuade people to stop smoking? What can you do to treat them and so on? But, this was, even then, I think in 2014, we saw that the nicotine space was rapidly changing. When you've got a safer product, it actually changes the way you view it. So we set up this, decided, I think, in the January of 2014, and by June we'd had the first conference with about 120 people or so, and it's grown. we decided right from the beginning that it would be multi-stakeholder. Fancy term, but it means everybody's invited. And I'd soon discovered that there are lots of conferences which don't invite people and exclude people. There are conferences which ban people with links with the industry. And we decided that everybody should be welcome because I suppose it was also a spin-over from the work that Paddy and I had done on HIV, AIDS, and on drug use conferences, where we tried to get everybody along, drug users, police, ministry officials, parliamentarians, educators, treaters. And it's a wonderful events where you'd have everybody in the room, and you'd have senior police staff talking to drug users, and in a sort of a collegiate, face, like a non-coercive way. I mean, they talk in other ways, but getting them in the room, talking about policy issues, human rights issues. So we imported that into the tobacco, smoking, nicotine arena. So it was always multi-stakeholder, getting everybody in the room: consumers, people from industry, people from public health, regulators, parliamentarians, and so on and so forth. But we realized that also wasn't an easy road. There are people who have joined us along the way and disappeared. There are people who've been banned from attending because there are industry people there. So we can go into that a little bit later as well. But the whole idea, get everybody together and talk. And GFN has that kind of space where people who might not otherwise meet can talk so one of my abiding memories is the director of one of the largest tobacco companies talking to this he's a very neat, straight man and talking to this long-haired Glaswegian vapor. Now, in their lives outside of GFN, they would never have met. So that's a bit of the magic. There's a lot of presentations, a lot of workshops, and a lot of panel discussions. But the idea is that get that dynamic going where you've got people coming together and bouncing around ideas and actually demystifying a lot of things. Yeah.
And we continue at this week and it's been ongoing.
Hey, Alex, you're breaking up again.
I'm sorry. Am I coming back? Am
I
improving?
Yep,
okay. I apologize. I don't know what's going on with my internet, but this has been a recurring theme, this idea of building consensus, which is not specific to this issue. Everybody would like to build consensus on things. But, the idea of providing a space for all of these, otherwise divergent ideas about the best policies and interventions to come together and meet on a collegial plane. And so I'm glad that GFN has at least attempted to serve that purpose as much as you can without others banning people from coming. And I am moving along here probably quickly. I know we're probably going to skip over a lot of things here.
Okay.
But one of the things that you talk about in the article, and I think this is related to what we were just talking about, is that there is a role for industry to play in all of this. And there's sort of two wings to this. I know that the U.S. experience is certainly different than what a lot of other countries are experiencing. But for us, we have a regulator who at the beginning of PMTA enforcement has said that they were really going to prioritize the top 5 companies by market share. And so, my question is, is that the best approach to go about maximizing the benefit from these products? And then a sub question here is, another thing you mentioned in the article is that the industry they haven't done enough to help the situation in low and middle income countries, and I'll expand that to generally marginalized communities. What could the industry be doing better? So is the regulator taking the right approach, and what are things that industry can be doing better?
The regulator is not taking the right approach, and looking at the US from here in the UK, it does seem a disaster. You've got a highly legal and bureaucratic structure which doesn't seem to be doing what it should be doing, which is making products available to compete and drive out cigarettes. In fact, the reverse is happening. You've got you've got companies going out of business, you've got vape shops going out of business. So it looks very odd because we don't have in the UK this kind of politicized, fervent atmosphere around vaping. We don't have MPs getting up and shouting about kids and what about the kids and all that stuff. So it looks very odd, and I've got a great lot of sympathy, although I don't know a lot of the details. I don't want to get into them. When it comes to companies, I think there are two things here. Very early on, I was of the view, and that view hasn't changed, that there are many people in tobacco control who wanted tobacco companies to disappear, cigarette companies. There'd be an end game. They'd come out, somehow we could drive them out. We could tax, we could regulate, and BAT and PMI would kind of go out of business. Now, that doesn't happen, and transformation doesn't happen like that in any field, whether it's in motor vehicles or energy and so on. So I realized early on that this would be a different kind of end game, where these companies became different kinds of companies, became nicotine companies rather than cigarette companies, and maybe, and it's happening with some, become more sort of pharma. Because you watch what's happening with PMI and to some extent with BAT. Now they've got the vaping technology. They're looking at delivering other things as well. They've got huge expertise now. But I suppose also, if you've got big companies in the space, you can get products on the shelves everywhere. They've got the marketing power. So that's good. But what's not good is the kind of the monopolization, the problems with innovation, the variety, the choice, and also the dynamics of what goes on in vape shops and elsewhere when you've got ordinary folk selling things to ordinary folk. Because tobacco companies will stack them in the supermarkets or stack them in the local newsagents, but they don't have that personal engagement with people. So what's been fascinating about many aspects of the vape field is, if you like, you've got a whole lot of smoking cessation shops. in fact, a vape shop is a local health advice shop, and it's an outreach shop, and it engages. So, on the one hand, big companies, mass sale. My sister or family member probably wouldn't necessarily want to go to a vape shop, but might pick. You've got wider appeal. But on the other hand, you need a very vibrant, varied market, and anything which drives power into the hands of a few big tobacco companies, it is not a good idea.
And so, for the second part of that was, what are the things that to some extent we're sort of stuck with because of the rules, not just in the U.S. but around the world, and in particularly in some LMICs that have reacted very poorly to this new technology. I think we all agree that tobacco companies have sort of an ethical obligation to help out and protect their consumers. What are there any specific things that you think tobacco companies could be doing to advance this?
Well, they could be doing better to develop products which are appropriate for the 80% of the smokers in the world who live in poor countries. So, we have high-ish tech solutions, things with batteries and complicated electronics and need electricity and so on and so forth. But, are these things suitable for smokers in poor countries? Now, in some situation that they might be, and you can have cheaper versions, but you do need to find develop other ways of delivering nicotine which are kind of lower tech. And like PMI with its fancy IQOS and other heat not burn products. I mean, these are kind of more on the not exactly smartphone end of things, but they're pretty complicated kind of gadgets and so on. So clearly tobacco companies have gone for richer markets, but 80% of the smokers in the world, there's 1 billion smokers in the world, and 80% of them are in low and middle income countries. Quite serendipitously, and I don't think it was planned like this, but I think the move into nicotine pouches might be what is going to be appropriate for poorer countries. The nicotine pouches are kind of not exactly green, but they're greener than other nicotine delivery systems. They're cheap, don't have storage problems. So this might be, where things begin to open up in Africa and in Latin America and in parts of Asia. I don't think tobacco companies planned it that way, but it seems to me that these things are going to be very suitable, and they seem to be very popular, including amongst vapors. Many vapors I know also use pouches, and I think moving to a nicotine area where people will use different things in different circumstances.
And you don't have to charge those, which is good.
You don't have to charge them. There's not much in the way of environmental
battery,
waste. There's no batteries. They're portable. You can't break them.
Right. But I was going to say, and yet we see the World Health Organization coming out against them just as hard as they have with the vape stuff. It's crazy.
It is crazy, and the World Health Organization is it's on the wrong side of the curve on this one, as it was with drugs harm reduction. I remember when we ran a drugs harm reduction conference in Geneva, and WHO staff were banned from coming to it. I mean, they were late to the game with drugs harm reduction. So, and they've got the wrong message here as well. It's partly funding, it's partly just that prism they've got into, which everything to do with smoking is to sort of hammer down on it, and they can't turn the 90 degrees on it. Everything, there's kind of stopping a controlling, coercive mentality as the solution, and it hasn't occurred to people at WHO that enabling, empowering, this is actually WHO language in other areas, enabling populations to change, empowering populations to change, helping, and that's what e-cigs and other safer nicotine products are about. You literally put in the solution into people's hands, So, but WHO hasn't got it, and it's going to take a long time. WHO is irrelevant to many countries, but for many poor countries, it's very relevant because they are seen as the fountain of wisdom. And if you don't have a national policy, if you don't have capacity to develop national policy, you look to WHO.
Right.
So I guess it's safe to say that for countries that are somewhat dependent on WHO for health advice and health information, that is it reasonable to expect that the messages about tobacco harm reduction aren't even reaching people on the ground?
I think, well, it's a difficult one to answer. I think there are a number of things going on. You've also got interference in many countries from campaign for tobacco-free kids, who have their activities in many poor countries. They help to write legislation. They help to message and provide the narrative. We've seen a lot of anti-THR stuff from WHO and from the International Biannual Meeting of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. I think in a way what works to our advantage is that many health ministries in many countries are not actually very interested in this issue. it seems to be a bizarre thing to say, but if you look at the crude regulatory scenario globally, you've got about 50 or 60 countries now with some sort of regulatory framework. You've got 35, 36 who've banned e-cigarettes.
Mhm.
Some of those are historical or like legacy bans because they've taken previous legislation and says, oh, that applies to these things. Only a few have introduced new bans, and you've got about 70 countries who've done nothing. And the done nothing thing is interesting because they've probably got so many other things that are important that getting excited about e-cigarettes is probably not very high on the agenda. I mean, they should get excited about safer nicotine products because if they're going to bring down non-communicable disease levels and so on, they need to tackle not just you need to tackle smoking. And in countries where you've got rather nasty oral tobaccos,
Mhm.
and they need to tackle those. But I sort of suspect that this is not a high priority issue for many poor countries.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm probably, well, touching back on what you were sort of talking about with Endgame. For those who weren't able to attend or watch E6 Summit this year, there was the sort of the final panel was included Mitch Zeller, former director of the Center for Tobacco Products, and Cliff Douglas, both sort of out on their own now, and Cliff Douglas coming from the American Cancer Society, and they had a good sort of discussion about endgame versus end state, and I think sort of the question I've sort of distilled from all of this was, can society accept nicotine use as something that is sort of a minority of people enjoy or otherwise benefit from, and I think there's always that sort of how do we get there and how long is this going to take type of question. But I think I wanted to save this towards the end to leave this in a bit of a hopeful state. But, from your perspective, what are the milestones? What are the tipping points? What have we seen so far? What do we expect to see going forward?
I think looking forward 10, 15, 20 years, my guess, I could be completely wrong and I won't be here to see it, but is that we're going to see the normalization of nicotine. So it will, once you've stripped it away from the smoke, then it becomes very hard to sustain objections to its use. You can't use terms like addiction. You can say people have a strong liking or a dependence. Some people, not everybody, but it's not an addiction. If you're not hurting yourself, what is the problem? So I think one scenario is a normalization of nicotine use. Continuing progress in the ways it can be delivered, and so that it doesn't cause much more excitement in the public mind than using coffee or something like that. And that's kind of one scenario. Sorry, I lost the thread a bit there, but the question was what?
Milestones and tipping points.
Milestones.
What have we seen so far? And then we talk about tipping points in other areas. I'm sort of curious, it's sort of a 100th monkey kind of scenario where like enough people from public health or tobacco control finally come around to, acknowledging the benefit here, or, what are the actual tipping points?
Yeah, I think my optimism is because what's driving this is not public health and it's not regulators. They can stand in the way and they can speed things up or they can slow things down. But the motor for this is consumers, people who found these products. They've heard them from a friends and family or whatever, and they've tried them and they like them. Not everybody does. Not everybody succeeds in switching from smoking to an e-cigarette. We need to think a little bit more about that. So what's driving it is consumer interest. It's a bit like saying, how do you get from, petrol engines to electric, or how do you get more people to ride bicycles? We're kind of, the state has a role in that, but for the most part, that's going to be kind of personal choices. So what's driving this is consumers and good products, because clearly there are a lot of things there that people prefer now to smoking. They're more interested than smoking, and certainly they prefer them to NRT, which is deadly dull and boring. What could you don't early on when I went to a vape fest. I only been to one vape fest, and I don't think I want to go again, because I don't vape and I don't smoke. But this was kind of interesting. You don't have NRT fests. You don't have people talking about have you heard this latest thing from Johnson & Johnson, the latest flavor, so it's kind of that facilitates all this happening. And even in the UK, which has the most positive approach to you could say it's government policy driving it, but it's not, because the big increase in vaping occurred before the policy developments. So consumers are leading this, and I'm not sure there'll be a tipping point, but the milestones are to make it possible for people to make these kinds of choices. So as I say in the article, and I've said, yes, now public health can get in the way, or governments can get in the way, or they can try to speed it up. There are some milestones in a way. The European Union Tobacco Products Directive, which was the first sort of big bit of legislation about e-cigarettes, didn't go through smoothly, but in fact there was a big consumer reaction to the initial proposals. A lot of us were unhappy with it at the time, but it actually looks a fairly sensible piece of legislation in comparison with what might be done in other places. It's pretty low key. It treats things as consumer products. You've still got some countries which are trying to ban flavors and so on and so forth. So that's an important milestone. New Zealand, I suppose milestones I'm picking out are kind of countries which have made good decisions, New Zealand. But it's not always policy that drives it. Look at Japan, look at Scandinavia, look at Sweden. It wasn't politicians saying, interesting, let's get behind these things. These were changes driven by people who are making choices about certain products. So in Sweden with snus, now in Sweden, smoking levels are around 5%, which technically is where you say smoking has all but disappeared. Lowest lung cancer rates in Europe. But the switch to snus, the Swedish government doesn't actually like to talk about it because it was never a policy. It was done. I sort of joke about Swedes sitting around the fishing and chewing, sucking on snus. But so that's my awful caricature. But somewhere along the line, Swedish men developed a better product, and Swedish men decided they liked it, and smoking rates kind of plummet. Snus rates go up. That crossover, that substitution chart that we've seen, in Norway, same sorts of substitution charts. Smoking going down, snus going up. So Norwegian women under 28, 25, 28, I can't remember exactly, 1% smoke. But about 14 or 15% use snus. And 10 years ago, it was the other way around. So it's not exactly tipping points, but what's driving this is that people, you've got to see these things as consumer products, and you've got to see smoking as a kind of consumer issue rather than a treatable issue.
Yeah. I think I had recently typed or said something to somebody, I mean, maybe I'm sort of mischaracterizing it in my mind, is I would think that for public health, for people in public health, policymakers and lawmakers, but and especially people in working for regulators, it seems like one of the most frightening things that any of them could hear would be, "We're going to do this without you."
Exactly.
And so it seems, the obvious solution to me is it's sort of the get out of the way kind of mentality, but more of maybe the UK's approach, which is establishing guardrails, but we don't have to build barricades.
Yeah, I think what you just said rings a number of bells, because part of the negativity from people in public health about this is about ownership. Public health people are quite interested in telling us, advising us, persuading us to less sugar, tax on soda drinks, the whole panoply of things. But they didn't invent this. If they had have invented it, it would have been a real mess. But there was a real problem of ownership here. So right from the beginning, all they could do was express concerns, cautions, so what I call fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yeah.
And in a way, they're right. They don't have much of a role here, because it's a public health benefit, but it's not driven by public health. I mean, Dave Sweeney has some good points on this as well. You think, when he talks about refrigerators, huge public health benefit, but that came from well, it's not about there's nobody negative about the refrigerators in public health, but that's not quite the analogy. But some of these things come along, and these are solutions to public health problems. And in the case of this tobacco arena, that got many public health people rather scared of what might be happening.
Yeah.
If I could, real quick, I wanted to do a quote from your article that was the one that just stood out to me. And it said that you'd worked on harm reduction and HIV prevention since the late 80s, and making drug use and sex safer was both contentious and a struggle. But even that did not face the organized, well-funded opposition endured by proponents of making nicotine use safer. And that was, to me, that was very powerful, because it really was. It's true. It's like, I mean, I remember in the 80s, the whole HIV thing, and how, because it was like a thing. And so they forgot all about women in Africa and, drug users, intravenous drug users and stuff. And I think I wanted to tie that real quick with Chelsea Boyd had a really good article on Our Street a day or so ago, where she talked about, when is safe enough? When are we going to give it a pass? And it seemed almost like, will they ever? Because even though public big H health didn't come up with this, they sure as heck have the power to stand in front of it and, Alex said, be the blockade. And that is tying into this question that just popped up in our chat, where they asked if tobacco control officials are so attached to coercion and the sense of power that many derive from it, that they simply can't give it up when it comes to vaping or tobacco harm reduction in general. So those are all kind of together, but it all kind of is they're standing in front of this. Are they doing this on purpose? Are they going to ever give up that power? And will tobacco harm reduction will anything ever be safe enough for them? Will it ever be good? Because they keep bringing up this, it's not safe, but we all know it's not safe. We just want safer.
Exactly. And in public health more broadly, safer is is part of the language. I mean, a lot of public health is about being safer, but people can't stop doing some things, but you can make things safer. Seat belts or is a good comparison. I think. Will they give it up? I mean, who are the people who make it? Australia's obviously gone down a bad route, where you've got a de facto prohibition. You've got this crazy idea that you can have these things, but they've got to be prescribed by a doctor.
Crazy. But go buy the deadly thing on the corner at the gas station.
Europe's pretty good. I mean, China's introduced some new controls over e-cigs in terms of flavors and so on. The main public health, well, there are countries in Europe where the public health agencies and what Clive Bates calls the body parts organizations, the foundations, which are the hearts, the lungs, make a lot of noise. In the UK, they're all a bit quiet. I think they just kind of lost interest a little bit in it. And Public Health England, which was the agency driving this, did some good work to bring the big cancer organizations, the heart organizations, and so on board. I think you've got a bigger problem in the US, partly because of the scale of funding for these organizations, and the funding from Bloomberg as well, which goes into many of them. So, in the campaigns organized by the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and so on. So there's a lot of money going around to sell a particular narrative. And will they give up? I don't know. That's a difficult one. The US is very concerned about kids, isn't it? This isn't really a narrative which is
no.
And
they're the
about the
Davids.
kids.
That's what's funny. You were just talking about all the money that they have, but they still look at themselves as being the Davids. We're apparently the Goliaths in this.
Oh, really? Well, we did. You were part of this, but we did a survey of consumer organizations, and the total annual funding for all of the 52 grassroots consumer organizations, like yours, and the national grassroots consumer organizations, it's about $350,000 a year in total.
For all of us?
For all
of you. All of you.
I know just from that,
and there are only 13 people in those 52 organizations who have any sort of paid position. It's all volunteer stuff. Like if it's Pro Mexico, or the organizations in Latin America, or the New Nicotine Alliance in the UK, it's all done on a shoestring. It's not like the $160 million that Bloomberg gave to Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids to argue against flavors. It's not like the 20 million that Bloomberg gives to the University of Bath to try to stigmatize a lot of people working in the field. Big sums of money going into the opposition, and you suffer more than other parts of the world from that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Yes. The same is true for bad policy that we export to the rest of the world. Yeah. And before we get too far away, I did want to acknowledge and maybe put it to you, the Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights asking about snus, and does snus cause oral cancer, and what are the oral cancer rates in Sweden? Before I pitch it to you, Gerry, I'll say we have information about snus on our website. To smoke and encourage you to. Got you here.
All right, you're breaking up again. We do have a whole section on our website on smokeless tobacco and oral tobaccos and stuff, so we encourage you to please go check that out on CASAA.org.
Yeah, Sweden now has studies going on for 20 or 30 years, large population-based studies, and when you aggregate those, it's very hard to detect any major cancer problems with snus. So people have been digging around. You find some individual studies, but I think there are particular aspects of those studies where you find a slightly raised level. But those snus gets a pretty good bill of health from these large studies. And you've got your fact sheet. So we've got a fact sheet on snus as well. We just looked at snus, and it's this has been very well studied. So and US smokeless likewise, sort of probably underrated in the US as a harm reduction product.
Oh yeah, for sure.
A lot of people don't realize. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that a lot of people don't realize that smoke-free tobacco is already significantly less risk for people's health than smoking.
Sure.
And then if you
Yes.
take snus on top of that, there's over 30 some odd years of studies, and they have not been able to prove that snus causes any disease, not just with cancer, oral cancer, but any disease. There's a couple outlier studies there, but it's pretty much as safe as coffee. So I mean, it's
I mean, and this is where the label, the naming of things is important, because most of the international WHO's work is all about tobacco, tobacco-free world. Well, no, you've got to actually work out what it is that's the problem. And, the problem is smoking. There are certainly some tobaccos which are chewed with other substances in India and so on, which are harmful. But they're mixed in with all sorts of things, and it's difficult to disentangle what is the tobacco, whether it's the slate line, the betel nut, or the areca nut, or whatever in it, which is associated with adverse health effects. And it's entirely wrong to call they're called smokeless tobaccos in a lot of the research papers, but it's entirely wrong to call that. It's a mixed bunch of vegetable matter and herbs with tobacco. It's not a very technical way of describing it, but they're wrongly called smokeless tobaccos.
This plutonium cigarette with some tobacco in it is a tobacco thing that's killing you. It's not the plutonium; it's the tobacco.
And just to sort of put a final point on this, if I can, the Swedish Match's General products were the first product in the United States to be granted a modified risk order. And there are four different flavors, I believe, that have been authorized. And also, I think recently Copenhagen, it's just Copenhagen. It's kind of hard to use. It's one product, but Copenhagen recently received modified risk orders, if I remember correctly. So we now have American moist smokeless and Swedish snus in America with modified risk orders, which is certainly a step in the right direction.
It is, certainly.
And in the final few minutes here, I promised you before we started I would ask this, and so I did want to squeeze it in. And it's not the positive high note that I wanted to end on, but maybe it is. Who knows? In the United States, we have seen this influx of fentanyl in the drug supply, and it's been responsible for drug poisonings for more than a decade. I think the first time I heard about it was when I was in treatment for substance use disorder in the mid 2000s, and it was fentanyl or it was other things that was contaminating the drug supply. But now this narrative has moved into essentially you can put fentanyl in everything and nobody knows where it is, and specifically in vapor products. We've even seen a tobacco company in the United States jump on the sort of hysteria bandwagon in their efforts to sort of demonize single-use vapor products, disposables, and drum up more energy funding or whatever for enforcement against these products. My take on this is that it's a bit of a mistake to be stigmatizing vaping and fentanyl, because there's more potential for drugs harm reduction there. And I'm curious if you've heard anything about this, what you might know about it, and thoughts for even more harm reduction applications.
Wasn't there a crazy story a few days ago about the Chinese might be putting fentanyl into disposable vapes? There was some bizarre, rather paranoid view of what's going on. Okay. Two things. One is it's another thing that's being used against vapes, just as all the muddle around Ivali, and so on. So, it's been used to bash vapes, but in principle, if there are drugs, well, not the right word, drugs of abuse, but difficult drugs, which can be vaporized, volatilized, and delivered through in some way, in something similar to a vaping delivery system, that is going to be preferable to people injecting those drugs or using other versions of those drugs which might be contaminated in some way. So as a kind of looking with my sort of drugs harm reduction hat on, if you can clean up the delivery system, then that could be great advantage. I mean, we had some discussions about that way back about whether the problem is many heroin, for example, doesn't volatilize at a low temperature. It has to go to about 700 or 800 degrees. So it wouldn't work in a vaping delivery system. But in principle, making drug use safer is a good idea. And if some drugs like that can be vaporized and made safer, there are some possibilities there for drugs harm reduction services. It's not quite the same, but in many European countries and in Australia, you have, I don't know about the US, you have drug testing programs at events and festivals and so on to just tell people what it is they're taking. So making drug use safer for people who will in any case be using those drugs is in principle a good idea, but it's a difficult area because it can be used to bash vaping. Yet another thing, people on an environmental bandwagon over disposables, and you have so is it just a scare story, or is there something interesting here in terms of drugs harm reduction is the question.
Yeah. Well,
I have a positive thing that I'd like to ask him to end on.
Okay, I'll give you the last word then.
Okay. What I would like to ask is, you talked a lot, or you spoke a lot in your article about consumers and getting consumers at the table. And what I'd love to know, and we have a hard time with that. I mean, just trying to, getting to GFN even is kind of, it's over there. Just, with legislators and all that kind of stuff, they don't look at us as being a stakeholder. They look at us as being, they're patting us on the head. And what I'm wondering is, what is GFN doing to get more consumers involved?
Well, we do set aside money to fund people to come. We have a small pot of money to bring people. We persuade others to bring people as well. But consumer organizations are under-resourced and often, as you just indicated, patronized. Which doesn't I don't think happens in other fields. You don't patronize cancer organizations, patient organizations. This is a very strange area where there's a lot of suspicion around vaping organizations. You're all in to pay a big tobacco, aren't you? Or it's if only you'd have a bigger budget. But
well, I have no qualms about disclosing that we accept donations from the industry. We've taken donations from tobacco companies, but we're not getting Bloom bucks.
It's difficult for many because that closes a lot of doors. Maybe not so in the US, but in many other countries
it does here too.
It closes doors. You have to be taken seriously. And it's still early days in many places. Many consumer organizations are run by a handful of people, volunteers, make a big noise, and can have an impact. And that, I think, is the final message, because we've seen that consumers have had an impact, had a big impact on European legislation. They send in answers to consultations, they legislative challenges, and you always got to be there making politicians know that you're looking over their shoulder at what they do. You won't always get what you want, but sometimes you will.
Sometimes you get what you need.
that came in my head too.
Thank you.
Well, excellent. I thank you for joining us, and I'll take it out. Michael Redfern noted in the chat that if you are a consumer and can't make the trip to Warsaw, that the GFN online programming is available for free. I've certainly taken advantage of that. I
forgot that. Yes, it's free, and this year it'll be online in Spanish and Russian.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Excellent.
Awesome.
So broadening the engagement and everybody participating. Gerry, we very much appreciate the work that you've done, the work that you're doing. I look forward to watching GFN from the comfort of my home this year. And hopefully I will work up the courage to travel to Warsaw.
Please do.
And so with that, I
Funding.
think we'll round out the hour with the standard CASAA outro of, if you haven't joined CASAA, you're doing everything wrong. Go to CASAA.org and join. While you're there, if you find this content useful or just important, even if it's not for you, please kick down a few bucks. Like I said, we do get donations from industry, but it's not as much as you think it is. And as Jerry's group has demonstrated, all of these consumer organizations are very underfunded. And if you don't have $5 or something to kick in, just get involved. Do the reading, the writing, and send the messages to lawmakers when we tap you on the shoulder. And people around the world hopefully have similar opportunities to get engaged. We have merch on our site. While you're there, check out the store. You can advocate in style with all the fancy T-shirts and stuff that we've designed. Danielle Jones, thank you very much. Follow us on social media. We're on the Facebooks and Twitters and Instagram, and you can find this podcast where you find all of your podcast not StreamYard. SoundCloud, Jesus, SoundCloud, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. I think I did all of the things.
I think
Did I do all the things?
I think so.
Okay, fantastic.
I was trying to pay attention to the chat. So anyhow, again, thank you for taking your time with us on this Saturday, and I guess we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
Yeah, see y'all later.